All of this is very clear. The United States is essentially pushing Germany into the line of fire. That is the argument that was made by a leftist member of the German parliament, the Bundestag. Her name is Sevim Dagdalen, and she is the spokeswoman for the left party, which is called Die Linke. And she's a member of the Bundestag's Committee on Foreign Affairs and a deputy member of the Defense Committee. And she's been a member of the German parliament since 2005. And she published a really good article that's titled "German Tanks in Russia. The U.S. Wants to Send Germany into the Line of Fire." And this German leftist politician spells out that the U.S. is trying to use Germany as cannon fodder in an imperial war to prevent Eurasian integration. She writes, "This is obviously about passing Germany the poisoned chalice. Berlin is to be sent into the line of fire to conclusively destroy German-Russian relations and turn them into open war for others' benefit." And when she says others, she means U.S. corporations' benefit. She says, the debate about sending the tanks, and that debate's over. Germany is going to send these tanks in a massive escalation of the proxy war. She says, this debate reveals the dangerous limits on German sovereignty. Ultimately, the German government cannot decide independently on delivering tanks. Bear in mind, this would entail the greatest security threat to face the German population since World War II. The United States, however, has sufficient influence in the governments of its fellow NATO countries to achieve the outcome it desires. This applies with respect to Germany, too. She says, Germany, it appears, is supposed to draw Russia's counterfire. One cannot escape the impression that it is hoped a possible counterstrike would hit Berlin first and foremost. The United States would thus have achieved one of its long-term strategic objectives to prevent cooperation between Germany and Russia forever. And this is confirmed in the book The Grand Chessboard that was published in 1997 by the U.S. imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was the national security advisor under U.S. President Jimmy Carter. He was the architect of the U.S. proxy war in Afghanistan, the proxy war against Moscow, against the Soviet Union. And he wrote in his book that the United States may have to determine how to cope with regional coalitions that seek to push it out of Eurasia, thereby threatening the United States' status as a global power. And he said very clearly in this book, I'll read a few quotes from this. He said, "Eurasia has been the center of world power. For the first time ever, a non-Eurasian power has emerged, not only as the key arbiter of Eurasian power, but also as the world's paramount power. The United States is the world's first truly global power." He wrote this back in 1997 at the peak of U.S. unipolar imperialist hegemony, in which the U.S. empire controlled the entire world, basically. And he says that whether the U.S. prevents the emergence of a dominant and antagonistic Eurasian power remains central to the United States' capacity to exercise global primacy. U.S.-American foreign policy must remain concerned with the geopolitical dimension and must employ its influence in Eurasia in a manner that creates a stable continental equilibrium with the United States as the political arbiter. Eurasia is thus the chessboard on which the struggle for global primacy continues to be played. And in this book, in 1997, Brzezinski said that the biggest threats to U.S. imperialist hegemony over Eurasia were, one, the creation of what he called an anti-hegemonic coalition led by China, Russia, and Iran. That's exactly what has happened in the emergence of this new multipolar world with this alliance between China, Russia, and Iran. But in this book, the Grand Chessboard in 1997, he also warned another threat to U.S. imperialist hegemony would be what he referred to as a Russo-German alliance. That is an alliance between Moscow and Berlin. And that is exactly what the United States has been trying to prevent in order to maintain its imperial control over Eurasia, and therefore in order to maintain its unipolar imperialist control over the global economy. It is to prevent Germany and Russia from economically and politically integrating, and by extension, preventing Germany from economically and politically integrating with China as the world's largest economy, according to purchasing power parity. Germany is a major industrial superpower, one of the world's largest exporters with a massive current account surplus. And if Germany, its German industrial engine, could be economically integrated with Russia's massive resource potential, with Russia's oil and gas, its huge energy reserves, its huge mineral reserves, then that would be an unstoppable economic power. If they can integrate it also with China's massive industrial capacity, Eurasia could easily overpower the United States and the hegemony of U.S. corporations, which want to control the world, as they did in the 1990s. So that is the goal of the U.S. pushing Germany into Russia's line of fire. That is why the Nord Stream pipelines between Russia and Germany were blown up. They were sabotaged. That is why the United States threatened sanctions on the Nord Stream pipelines, and CIA director turned Secretary of State under Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, said that the United States would do everything it could to prevent the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from opening. And it never was opened, and it probably never will be opened. So finally, going back to this article from this German leftist politician from the Die Linke, the left party, she said in this article to the Dagblad, she said, in the context of the U.S. policy of confrontation with the Eurasian bloc, Germany and Japan are to become frontline states with limited sovereignty for the United States. She says, in this situation, the German warmongers, people like the foreign minister Baerbock, are, quote, acting as if they want primarily to serve the interests of U.S. corporations and the the United States as a whole. So Savim Dagdalin points out this is all about U.S. corporations profiting from all of this and maintaining their imperial hegemony so they can exploit the natural resources and markets and labor of the planet. And she says that now what we are seeing is the country no longer believes, our society no longer believes in social progress and is being swept along by a destructive oligarchization of the economic and political spheres while masses of people slip into poverty. So she's talking about how capitalism inherently pushes for war, and she says, anyone who is really interested in defending democracy in Germany cannot leave the stage to the mouthpieces of a bored bourgeoisie just because they are afraid to be derided as stooges of the enemy. That is what happened in the First World War, and it must not happen again. We must do all we can to put a spanner in the works for Germany's warmongers. And of course, when she says spanner, that's for people in the US, that's a wrench. In Britain, they say spanner to refer to a wrench. That's their version of saying, and this was translated by Jeremy Corbyn's new organization, which is called Liberation in Britain. And when they say throw a spanner, they mean throw a wrench into the gears. So this German politician, Savim Dagdalin, member of Bundestag, was calling for throwing a wrench into the gear of the German war machine. She's a very, very impressive politician, probably one of the best politicians in Germany, consistently anti-war, anti-imperialist, and she also has been a huge supporter of Julian Assange, calling for him to be freed, the political prisoner and journalist. So people can follow her over at Twitter at Savim Dagdalin, and if they want to read her article, they can go to check out the article that I wrote over at geopoliticaleconomy.com. I have links to all of the sources that I discussed today, and I will always be reporting on this very dangerous situation. I'm very concerned it could escalate, even potentially to nuclear war, which would mean nuclear apocalypse. I mean, we are in a very dangerous historical moment, and I will always be here reporting on it daily, and I will be providing analysis here at Geopolitical Economy Report. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com/support, or you can become a patron over at patreon.com/geopoliticaleconomy. Any support you could provide goes a long way. We are completely independent. We have no institutional support. And I will be here. I'm Ben Norton. I will be back very soon for more reporting and analysis here, and always as a video version at YouTube, and also a podcast version for people who prefer listening. I'm Ben Norton. I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this second Geopolitical Economy Hour. I'm Radhika Desai.
And I'm Michael Hudson.
Thanks to all our viewers for making our inaugural show such a success. As many of you know, in this collaboration with Ben Norton's Geopolitical Economy Report, Michael and I will present every 2 weeks a discussion of the major developments and trends that are so radically and rapidly reshaping the world order. Issues that involve not just politics and economics, but rather, as Michael and I like to put it, political economy, and as my 2013 book had it, geopolitical economy. Today's discussion is focused on inflation, on its much debated return after many, many decades. And we thought we would structure our discussion around certain key questions. What is inflation? What is the textbook definition? How has it been understood in the past? What causes inflation? What are the supply and demand side factors? Given that capitalism is considered such a powerful productive machine, why are the most powerful capitalist countries suffering from inflation today? What does it say about their productive system? What is, in fact, causing the current inflation? What's the Federal Reserve in the United States, particularly the most powerful central bank in the world, particularly, is doing about it? And what's wrong with what the Federal Reserve and many other central banks are doing? So, Michael, why don't you just start with your thoughts on the first question?
Well, of inflation. And I think most people are expecting us to talk about consumer price inflation because that's what the media talks about. I'm going to give you my punchline first because that's how we're going to end up this discussion. What has really been inflated since 2008 has not been consumer prices, but asset prices, real estate prices, stocks and bond prices, things that the 1% hold. Wealth has been inflated, much more than goods and services, and especially for real estate. This debt has been inflated not by government debt, not by government deficits, but by the Federal Reserve's creating $9 trillion of subsidy to the banks to support real estate prices and hence the value of bank-held mortgages and stock and bond prices. This is not discussed or even recognized in the mainstream economic models. Instead, we have a kind of mythology by right-wing, anti-labor financial lobbyists. So this mythology is about what I think most of the listeners are expecting us to discuss, the inflation of rising consumer prices. And that's the only kind of inflation that the Federal Reserve talks about. And this is all blamed on increasing the money supply, as if somehow money is creating the inflation. They're not talking about inflation as a result of monopoly pricing. They're not talking about inflation as a result of NATO's sanctions against Russia. They're just talking about money, and somehow, if we can stop money supply, if we can stop the government spending so much money on Social Security and Medicare and other social spending, but not military spending, then everything will be over. So we're actually going to be talking about the relationship between the inflation of housing and asset prices on the one hand, and how this actually affects the inflation of consumer prices, and how debt and inflation all go together.
So thanks, Michael. I think I'm also going to follow suit and just give people a sort of a little preview of the where we are going to end up. I think
Yeah.
Michael's absolutely right. There are actually two distinct inflations to be talked about. One is asset price inflation, and the other, which is real. It's happening right now. People are feeling it in their pocketbooks and in their bank accounts and so on, which is consumer price inflation. But nevertheless, there are some very interesting relationships between them. And one a part of the relationship is that, of course, as Michael said, the Federal Reserve constantly talks about the consumer price inflation, but in reality, its actions are geared towards asset price inflation, not towards dampening it. On the contrary, towards keeping it going. And this is going to be, from my point of view, from various things that I've written, including an article called Vectors of Inflation that I published in the New Left Review blog called Sidecar a few months ago. In this, I argue that precisely because the Federal Reserve actually wants to keep asset price inflation going, because that is the sort of financial house of cards on which the wealth of so many extremely wealthy people, big financial corporations, high net worth individuals depends. In order to preserve this wealth, the Federal Reserve is actually also not going to be able to tackle inflation in the only way it can, using the sledgehammer of high interest rates. This might mean a little bit of good news for some of us, but nevertheless, it still means that the underlying problems are not being solved. So let me, with that, return also, having sort of, you've seen where Michael and I want to take the conversation, let me return to the question of what is inflation, what is the textbook definition. So generally speaking, the textbook definition of inflation involves essentially, too much money chasing too few goods. There is a decrease in the purchasing power of money. There is a devaluation of money, and so on. And of course, the Federal Reserve and most people, as Michael already pointed out, believe that so the textbook definition of money is one in which money loses purchasing power. It is devalued. It happens due to money printing. And the conventional view, which Michael has pointed out the Federal Reserve generally tends to subscribe to, was expressed by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz in a book they wrote back in 1963, in which they claimed that inflation is everywhere always a monetary phenomenon, which means it is caused by essentially the Federal Reserve and other central banks supplying too much money into the system. And this can only be quashed essentially by restricting the money supply, by raising interest rates, by employing other means such as we now know, so-called quantitative tightening, in order to release so in order to restrict the supply of money. And of course, everybody remembers, or not everybody, but some people who are old enough will remember that back at the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s, Paul Volcker imposed precisely such a shock on the American economy, essentially to quell inflation. So the textbook definition is this. But Michael, how would we criticize the textbook definition?
Well, it only looks at money, as you just said from the Milton Friedman quote, but it doesn't look at all the non-monetary causes of inflation. For instance, we've seen oil prices and food prices rise simply as a result of the sanctions against Russia. We've seen the pharmaceutical prices rising, especially from Martin Shkreli, who vastly increased other prices. All across the board in the United States, companies have been saying, we're raising the prices because we think there's going to be an inflation, and we're just trying to rise it in advance. So now that ever since the Democrats really took power in the 1990s under Clinton, they've stopped the anti-monopoly regulation. They've stopped the antitrust laws from being enforced, and you have a great concentration of monopolies, and they can raise prices for whatever they want, as much as they want. For agricultural goods, the distributors have simply raised the prices without paying the farmers and the dairy farmers anymore. So when you say that inflation is only a monetary phenomenon, what Milton Friedman is saying is Don't look at the power structure. Don't look at how markets are structured. Don't look at monopolies. Don't look at how the wealthy corporations are inflating. Look at something that we can blame on labor. And the inflation that Milton Friedman talks about, and you just mentioned my old boss's boss, Paul Volcker, is wages. So when the Federal Reserve talks about inflation, they say it's really wages rising. Well, we know that wages have not risen anywhere near as fast as the cost of living. So that can't be the reason that wages are rising. But if you can claim that inflation is only caused by labor making too much money and hurting other workers as consumers, then you have the Federal Reserve able to come in and say, we've got to have a depression. We've got to have unemployment. We're going to raise interest rates because we want more unemployment to increase the reserve army of the unemployed so that wage earners will be so desperate for a job that they'll work for less. And if only they work for less, then prices will come down, as if somehow the companies are going to lower their prices just because they can pay their labor less. The pretense is that it's all it's all labor's fault.
No, and Michael, I completely agree with you, and I would actually just go a little step further, basically by insisting that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. And in that original work by Friedman and Schwartz, and later on in many other pronouncements, Milton Friedman has even said it's not even about the unions. He's not saying that because he, particularly cares about the unions. But the reason he's saying that is basically because people like him insist that the only way to deal with inflation is, as you said, is to cause a recession. So by restricting money supply sufficiently, and in fact, money supply has to be restricted to a point where interest rates go above the rate of inflation. So, for example, that would have meant back in last June, for example, in the United States, where inflation was close to above 9%, in fact, that the rate of interest rates would have to go above that in order to dampen inflation. So the point is that by insisting on monetary authorities causing inflation, what you're doing is you're saying the only way of dealing with this is to cause a recession, to cause an unemployment which is sufficiently high that it will drive down prices of drive down wages, that is to say the price of labor, and also therefore the price of everything else. You simply quash demand to such an extent, and therefore you're saying that you restrict people's consumption. And by the way, at the present moment, yes, it may be difficult to say that wages are causing inflation, although strike activity has been going up in the United States and in many other countries. They are only running to catch up with the extent to which workers' wages have gone down to such an extent. But nevertheless, what they are doing is they are pointing to the stimulus that the US government has given, which they say is now gone into the pockets of people and is causing inflation, is basically pushing up demand. But in reality, if we look at the studies that have shown exactly where the stimulus went, again, most of the stimulus never even ended up in the pockets of people. And the little bit that did, more or less, immediately left those bank accounts to go to the bank accounts of the big financial institutions, because ordinary people are so indebted that they were essentially deleveraging, they were reducing that debt. So anyway, that's an interesting initial take on the first question, which is, how the textbook definition is such a misunderstanding of inflation. So maybe we can move towards, how inflation is understood and also experienced historically. And maybe I should just start by saying that essentially, historically, we've seen that inflation has typically been the result of major disruptions. Wars cause inflation, various obviously economic crises have caused inflation. And yes, it's not entirely untrue that it's possible that an influx or an influx of money material, as happened in the 16th and 17th and 15th, 16th and 17th centuries in Europe due to the discovery of gold in the New World, and gold and silver. So this influx of money did cause a rise in prices. But the fact of the matter is, very interestingly, it was directly connected with the birth of capitalism. The rise in prices actually encouraged the economic activity that gave rise to capitalism in these centuries.
Well, you mentioned the inflow of money, and that is another area where Milton Friedman went wrong. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz had no concept at all of what money is. They actually put forth a great falsification that has been leading to confuse people for the more than half a century, ever since I had to go through school and actually read the book. Money is, most people think of it as an asset, what you have in your pocket. But all monetary assets have debt on the other side of the balance sheet. All money is debt. The currency in your pockets is actually technically a debt to you. Most currency is $100 bills, and they're shrink wrapped, sent in airplanes to pay Al Qaeda, to Ukraine, to pay Mr. Zelensky, to pay kleptocrats. They're used by drug dealers. They're put in the mattresses all over the world. They have nothing to do with American inflation. By far, most money is bank credit, and bank credit is debt. And if you look at debt, then you have a whole different perspective, not only on inflation, but how wealth is created and how the economy is polarizing. And you have to look at the whole economy as an economic system, which you and I have been talking about for years. And the purpose of the mainstream media talking about inflation is to prevent you from looking at how the economy is working, to prevent you from looking at how corporations are rising prices, to prevent you from looking at monopolies and war. People talk about hyperinflation, and again you will see in the New York Times and the Washington Post and even the Wall Street Journal saying, well, if we keep running budget deficits to spend on Social Security and Medicare, we're going to end up like Zimbabwe or like Germany in the 1920s. Well, as I've shown in my book, Super Imperialism and Killing the Hosts, every hyperinflation in history has resulted from trying to pay foreign debt. It's by dumping your currency on the foreign exchange market to pay debts denominated in another currency. Germany was saddled with a war debt far beyond its ability to pay, and the Reichsbank kept throwing German marks onto the foreign exchange. The currency collapsed. You had the United States, inflation of the 1970s, caused by the balance of payments deficit for the war in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and the almost 800 military bases the United States had. But you're not going to have any of the media saying, well, it's the war debts and the war spending that's causing the inflation. It's just, look at what happened in the 1970s. Wages went up. That must be what caused inflation. And Paul Volcker, who you mentioned, walked around with a chart in his pocket of construction industry wages. And he said, until we can bring down construction industry wages, largely by the poorest sector of the population, then we're not going to fight inflation. He didn't say we've got to bring down housing prices or stop the bond prices. We've only got to bring down wages and increase profits, because the profits will all be used to spend on more investment, and that will save us all. So all of this is a fairy tale.
Absolutely.
Based on the lack of understanding of what money is.
Yeah, and this is very interesting, Michael. One thing that so I wanted to pick up on from what you said early on just now is that the Federal Reserve can print a lot of money. Federal Reserve has been printing money hand over fist, like essentially throughout this century, and particularly after the 2008 financial crisis. So if there was going to be inflation, how come it didn't happen earlier? for the simple reason, as you rightly point out, is that when the Federal Reserve prints money, it can go in one of two directions. It can either go into the financial system, where it is hoarded, where it is used for speculation, precisely in order to drive up the asset prices that you are so emphasizing, Michael, totally correctly. Or it can go into the economy, leading to productive investment, etc. And that is what it has not been doing. The kind of, basically every period of economic growth is actually connected with at least mild inflation. Because essentially, and rising prices are actually a boost to the economy. I remember reading many years ago Pierre Villar's History of Gold and Money, in which he points out that actually, had it not been for the effects of the inflation in the early centuries of the emergence of capitalism would not have emerged. Because you see, left to itself, if capitalism functions as it's supposed to, which is to constantly bring down the prices of things, capitalism would suffer from a deflationary environment, which would be a curb on investment. So mild inflation there's nothing wrong with it. And of course, in the neoliberal period, it's precisely, if people may remember, in the 80s and 90s, our central banks were aiming for zero inflation, which is essentially very deflationary. It's basically saying that we are not going to allow for any productive investment, any productive growth, etc., etc. So absolutely, if the money is not going towards productive investment, then it's not going to cause consumer price inflation, as it had not been when you had all this money printing that went on throughout the 21st century in the United States. So this also brings us to another question, and I guess we have now sort of slipped into talking about the third question, which is what really causes inflation, both the demand and supply side and so on. And I want to talk about both consumer price inflation and asset price inflation. But I maybe want to open up with a certain thing, because the Federal Reserve's policies and the policies of many other central banks that have sort of drunk the neoliberal Kool-Aid, the monetarist Kool-Aid, and so on. Essentially, it is to claim that the only way to deal with inflation is to have high interest rates, and this is essentially a class war. It's a class war in at least two senses. At both ends of it, it's a class war, because on the one hand, by causing high levels of unemployment, what you are doing is you are devaluing labor, which is the only thing we have to sell. The vast majority of working people, all they have to sell is their labor. So by causing a recession, by increasing interest rates, you are devaluing labor. On the other hand, by increasing interest rates, by keeping asset prices high, you are preserving the wealth of the wealthy. And this is not the least reason why this century has seen such a great shift in income from labor to capital, and particularly to financial capital. And that is why we have seen inequality rise to such obscene levels.
Well, the result is what has been called the Hudson paradox. And I've described that in my book, Killing the Host. More money and credit is used to bid up asset prices for housing and retirement income, and that puts downward pressure on consumer spending. Because if you have to spend more money on paying a mortgage on a house that's rising in price, if you have to spend more money on rent, if you have to spend money on monopolized healthcare services, on monopoly goods in general, then you're going to have less and less income to spend on goods and services. And again, what's deflated is spending of 99% of certainly 90% of the population on goods and services, because their spending is diverted to pay for access to assets and to monopolized goods, and for goods that are subject to protectionism or warfare. So the irony is that asset price inflation leads to rising housing prices and consumer income deflation, and you have to look at the economy as an economic system, not simply we're only looking at two variables, consumer prices and money. You have to look at who owns the wealth, who owes what to whom, how much debt is diverting money away from consumer spending to the upper asset holders, the 1%, the 10% who own most of the stocks and bonds and real estate, and who are now buying up private capital investment in medical practices, in almost every kind of consumer goods, and taking them private and sharply raising the prices. If you don't look at how the economy is structured, and how the ownership is changing, and the relationship between ownership and non-ownership, and consumption and labor, you're going to miss all of the variables that are really necessary to explain how the economy works. And most discussions of inflation are designed to avoid talking about how the economy works.
Precisely. And how it's structured. I mean, I think the Hudson paradox is absolutely fascinating. And on top of that, I would perhaps add a, shall we say, a Desai corollary to the Hudson paradox. And that would be that in their own way, in its own way rather, asset price inflation actually adds to consumer inflation for the simple reason that when you have asset price inflation, some people, of course, are getting very rich, and they can afford to pay wildly inflated prices for various goods and services and so on. So because they can easily pay, they end up driving the prices up further because they can pay, and so enough people are making money by selling at those prices. So in that sense, they can also keep inflation going. Now, this brings us, of course, to the discussion of what causes inflation. And perhaps, Michael, if I may just kick it off by just presenting a very simple scenario. The simple scenario is, imagine that, yes, look, I mean, saying that inflation is too much money chasing too few goods is essentially reading the symptom. Like, it's a bit like saying you have a fever. But doctor, why do I have a fever? Is it because I have an infection? Is it because I have some other illness, more serious illness, etc.? So you have to examine why too much money is chasing too few goods. In any healthy capitalist economy or any healthy market economy, you would expect that if there are prices are rising of certain goods, or mainly many goods, there would be a supply response. Energetic, intrepid capitalists would invest precisely in those lines of production where there are rising prices. And once, of course, they start increasing the production of those goods, prices would normally come down. So in any decently organized capitalist economy, in any reasonably productive capitalist economy, there should be a supply response, and therefore if inflation does occur, it would be temporary, it would be in certain goods and services. So why has there been general rises in consumer prices over time? What have been the causes? So I would say that certainly there can be rises in particularly in the prices of two sorts of commodities, which are quite special. And then, of course, there can be mismanagement of money. So yes, there can be monetary oversupply. Yes, there can also be rising wages if unions are strong, and we hope that they would be, that they can, in fact, increase wages, and that can add to the price of things. And it has happened historically at various points. I would definitely say that was an element in the 1970s when unions were indeed strong. And there is a third very key reason why you can have inflation, and that is commodity price inflation. Both sorts of primary commodities, the products of agriculture as well as the products of mining, can have big lags in production, so you can have rising prices, but it takes a long time before additional supply can come on the market. In agriculture, because of course you have to wait till the next season for the production of that commodity, or in the case of mining, because a lot of investment has to go into mining before the new supplies can come on the market. And so there are many other issues involved with these, but these are some of the common reasons why you can have inflation. But Michael, maybe perhaps you wanted to add something.
Yes, you've been focusing so far, and quite correctly, on physical output, but the main inflation has been on infrastructure services. Education, getting a cost of education has gone up much more than other things. Medical care. What's caused this is the privatization of what used to be social infrastructure services. The whole dynamic of industrial capitalism a century ago was to lower the cost of basic needs, of retirement income, of health care, of education. Because if you could provide these basic needs freely or at subsidized prices, then you wouldn't have to pay labor more wages to buy a high-priced education or high-priced healthcare. You would make your industry more productive because you lower the cost of living by socializing the cost of education, medicine, transportation, communications, and look at what happened in England after Margaret Thatcher. Privatizing council housing pushed housing prices way up, tripling, doubling, 10 times as high. Same thing for medical care, way up. Privatization of infrastructure has been probably the single major cause of price inflation, squeezing the budgets of the 99%.
And Michael, I'd add something to that. This is you already mentioned this, and of course, a lot of left-wing economists are pointing out, people like Robert Reich and others, quite correctly, that it definitely a very large part or a very large contribution has been made to the current inflation precisely by these sorts of privatizations, which is not just privatization in a competitive market, but practically every one of these privatizations has been a form of privatization in which they have created private monopolies. And so the contribution of private monopolies to rising prices has definitely been very high.
Well, these monopoly prices also have included a huge amount of debt service and consumer of the prices of these monopolized services have increased not only because of higher debt service, but because of higher dividends, higher managerial payments. None of this would occur under the previous public sector services. So you have a transformation in the organization of industry as a result of privatization that builds huge financial costs to the banks and to the financial sector into the pricing of goods and services. So the whole character of what the prices consist of is transformed and expanded and inflated.
So, Michael, what you're saying is really fascinating because, on the one hand, of course, by diverting so much income towards these high priced goods, on the one hand, this should lead to obviously inflation in the prices of these goods and so on. But it should also, that by depressing consumer demand elsewhere, it should actually have a depressive effect on the prices of other things. But we are seeing the prices of all of these things going up anyway, which brings us to the next question. Everywhere we look, in most of the literature, even in much of the so-called Marxist literature, we find a depiction of capitalism where capitalism is sort of the best thing since sliced bread as far as the productive system is concerned, that capitalism continuously expands the production. It is the only system that is capable of doing so. In fact, indeed, back in the 1950s or 60s,